Hi everybody. Welcome back to English 221, and this is for a class for Monday, the 8th of March, where we are finishing up viewing Much Ado About Nothing. I had you watch the first 3 acts last class, so now we've got 2 acts left. So you can start at minute 58 and 22 seconds and continue on until the ending of the movie, which is 1 hour and 50 minutes and 58 seconds. That will get us through Act 4 and Act 5. And you can see that in the notes in the bottom, I put down some information about both of those acts. We know that in Act 4, we can expect some descending conflict. So what we get in Act 4 is a rather brutal scene with Claudio rejecting Hero at the altar of their wedding. And we see that Hero's father is so humiliated that he wishes his own daughter were dead. And we've talked a little bit about this with Midsummer Night's Dream, about the importance of listening to a father's will. And we can see how ultimately a father's reputation is based on his daughter's purity. And then the friar, who represents a voice of reason in all of this, he schemes or devises a scheme to have Hero fake her death. The assumption being that we value that which we don't have, which is true. And Beatrice at this point asks Benedict to avenge Hero and the destruction of her reputation, and Benedict agrees, which goes to show the kind of power that Beatrice has over Benedict. And things could get very dark here, but we know that this is a comedy, so there's got to be resolution, and that's exactly what Act 5 is, resolution. So in Act 5, we've got Benedict threatening Claudio, but then Dogberry, of all people, our incompetent constable, is the one who exposes Hero's innocence. Pretty typical, again, for Shakespeare to have some lower level characters engaging in some higher level activity. Leonato says to Claudio that he will accept Claudio's apology if Claudio agrees to marry Leonato's niece. At this point, Claudio is feeling quite badly because he realizes that Hero was indeed innocent. It turns out that Leonato's niece is none other than Hero herself, and in this way she's kind of resurrected, much like her reputation is resurrected, which we will talk about as the semester progresses. Claudio and Hero reunite. Benedict and Beatrice are also forced to publicly admit their love to one another. And finally, Don John is going to be punished later, which is the ending of the play. So we'll talk about some themes and some important quotes for the play next class. But at this point, I just wanted to remind you again that I've put some information about how to write papers in the syllabus and other documents folder. And this particular handout about the critical paper, where you are not using outside resources, you are relying on your own interpretation and analysis, is a handout that I myself received in college. And it's one of the best I have yet to see about dividing up the elements of writing a paper. And it's divided up into planning, writing, and finally the proofreading stage. And I suggest that you start early so that you can devote enough time to planning and devote enough time to proofreading, since many times writers go immediately to the writing stage and they make the task more difficult for themselves. And in the section about planning, it talks about the need for you to analyze, not to summarize the play. The assumption is that the reader already is familiar with the play. What you are doing is you are trying to interpret. And you need to do that by beginning with a strong and specific thesis, some sort of a position that reasonable people could disagree about. And that argument suggests that there's going to be some sort of interpretive conclusions about the work that is usually included in your introductory paragraph. That said, while your introductory paragraph is your first paragraph, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the first paragraph you need to write. Many times what students will do is write their body paragraphs with their evidence, reread what they've read, try to summarize that in a sentence or two, and then ultimately they come up with their thesis. So you can reread your points and see if there's some commonality within them. So you can actually work backwards. And the thesis should be specific, and you'll see that in the handout it gives an example of 2 that are not specific, that would not work very well for a paper. The first being, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. And that's a weak thesis because it basically says nothing, because every author examines the complexities of experience. Likewise, saying that Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet is saying very little as well, because we can say that every author employs a good amount of imagery in whatever their work happens to be. So what you want is something specific. So if you want to talk about imagery, what is the imagery that Shakespeare is employing in his play, and for what purpose? That would be your thesis. Now, your paragraphs should be 3 or more sentences, and I know that oftentimes in journalism you can find a paragraph that's 1 or 2 sentences, but this is not a class in journalism. This is a class in literary analysis. So you want to make sure you have well-developed paragraphs. These are the kinds of paragraphs that you would also be writing in the world of business. And that means that your opening sentence, which is also known as the topic sentence of each paragraph, if it's well written, probably summarizes the main points of your paragraph. So what you should be able to do is to read the first sentences of all of the paragraphs in your paper and basically get a good summary of what the major points are in your paper. Your job is to support your points with evidence, and that means either quotation, direct language from the text, or paraphrase. In other words, you are using your language to explain something that's happening within the text. So you want to avoid the extremes. You don't want to submit a paper with no quotation, but you also don't want to submit a paper with too much quotation. In other words, you're using quotation to give your paper length. Length should come from your arguments, not from the number of quotes that you happen to be using. Think of the reader's position as basically taking the opposite viewpoint of yours. So whatever it is that you're going to argue, let's say that Hermia is a strong woman in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the reader will take the opposite perspective. No, she's not. So basically you have to prove this through evidence from the text, whether it be quotation or paraphrase. And your position just needs to be possible. It doesn't need to be probable. It doesn't even need to be conclusive. This is not a court of law. So basically, as long as you've put together enough evidence so that there is a possibility of your thesis being accurate, then that's enough. Which is why you can have multiple papers, all with very different viewpoints, some that even contradict one another, and all those papers can be A papers if they are constructed in such a way that they're using evidence from the text to support their particular positions. And generally, you don't want to end the paragraph with a quote. The reason why is because you usually comment on the relevance of a quote. Again, there's always exceptions. And you want to, in your very last paragraph, your concluding paragraph, find an interesting way to conclude. Again, you want to make sure you have a developed paragraph of 3 or more sentences. You don't want to just rephrase your opening, but you could perhaps relate your thesis to contemporary times. That's something that almost always works in a conclusion. Or perhaps you can relate your text to another text by the same author. Or again, you can summarize your main points, but you don't want it to sound like your introduction. And then the second piece, the writing piece, as you can see if you're looking along on this handout, is the first principle of writing is economy and the second is simplicity. In other words, you want to be as concise as possible. So generally speaking, you want to begin writing your paper early enough so that you can review your sentences and ask yourself after reading each sentence, can I rephrase this sentence in fewer words and not sacrifice its meaning? And if you can, generally speaking, you should rephrase that sentence. And I know how frightening that can be, because once you've done that, you are losing length in your paper. But again, remember, length should come from arguments, not necessarily from unnecessary language. Better to have a shorter, well-written paper than to have a longer paper that really should have been shorter just because it was wordy or because it was redundant. You want to vary your sentences with a mix of long and short sentences. You don't want several sentences in a row to begin the same way, so you want to vary your sentence beginnings. You want to try to use the active voice whenever possible. So when a sentence is being active, it's very clear that the subject of the sentence is engaging in an action. For instance, Lillian graded the journals. The subject of the sentence, who or what is doing the action, is Lillian. The action is graded. So it's very clear that Lillian is doing the grading. So that would be active. The passive voice would be the journals were graded by Lillian, and it's as if the action grading was occurring to the subject, Lillian. Both sentences say the same thing, but one is more concise. And remember the rule about trying to be concise as much as possible. So, some random notes. Avoid cliches and overused expressions. And I know that some of those expressions actually originated in some of Shakespeare's plays because the course of true love never did run smooth, if you'll remember from A Midsummer Night's Dream. But Shakespeare created that, so you don't necessarily want to repeat that in your own writing unless you are actually quoting from Shakespeare. So, what you want to do is to rephrase it into something original. And you want to avoid slang, which is usually language that is created by a group of people so that others can't understand what's being said. It's what teenagers do every generation. They create slang. And sometimes that slang goes mainstream and everybody's using it, but it's still considered to be informal. So you can take a slang term like cool. When I say somebody is a cool person, I'm not talking about that person's temperature. I'm talking about their personality, that they happen to be interesting and engaging. And again, if you're familiar with the slang, that makes a lot of sense. But if you were writing, you wouldn't want to say that this person was a cool person if you were writing formal academic sentences. Instead, you might want to say that that person was interesting or engaging, or find another way to say it. And if you're wondering why we try to avoid cliches and slang, it's because there's a greater possibility for misunderstanding. That there could be somebody who isn't familiar with the cliche or with the slang, or perhaps a second or third language user that isn't necessarily that familiar with it. So when we talk about academic English or the English of business, it's the standardized form that's considered to be the universal way of expressing oneself, even though we know that in our language and in informal writing situations, texting for instance, we can express ourselves in very different kinds of ways. Also, remember to keep in the present tense. So I know the temptation is to write about the plays in the past because they occurred in the past and because you read them in the past, even if you just read them a few hours ago. But talk about them in the present. It's not that Benedict said, it's Benedict says. So keep it in the present tense. A couple of other points. Avoid the use of I because that is already assumed within the paper itself that the paper is about you. So that would be considered to be redundant. You don't need to say, I think that Beatrice loves Benedict. You can just say Beatrice loves Benedict. And try to avoid contractions when you are taking two words and you are combining them into one. Don't, can't, won't. There's nothing wrong necessarily with writing a contraction, but it is considered to be a little bit more formal when you are writing out the words. And then finally, there's the proofreading stage. What you might want to do if you're having difficulty proofreading is read backwards. Read from page 4, let's say, and work your way all the way to page 1 so that you aren't concentrating on content, you're concentrating on the actual sentences themselves. Your paper and work should have a title, and it should be original to your thesis. So you wouldn't want to call your paper, for instance, Much Ado About Nothing, because that title's already been taken. Though you can incorporate part of the title within your own. So you could create a title, something like Love and Much Ado About Nothing. And that would be considered to be a unique title, because Shakespeare never wrote anything called Love and Much Ado About Nothing. He only wrote something called Much Ado About Nothing. And the conventions for when you are referring to a poem or a shorter work is you put the title in quotation marks if that poem or shorter work has been published. If it is a longer work, such as a drama, for instance, you either italicize or underline. And to give you an idea of how old the handout is, it says instructors prefer typewritten pages. So obviously this does have to be typed. Double space, 1-inch margins, probably 12-point font. It's pretty standard of what you would do in most of your writing assignments. You do want to have a title page, which is just a separate sheet of paper that lists things like your name, my name, the title, the class, the due date, the paper number. All of this is included in your syllabus. And you can see that the paper is due on the date assigned. But of course, if you need an extension, you can always ask me. And for quotation, what I thought I would do is talk a little bit more about that next class as we begin to talk about the play Much Ado About Nothing, and where we are in terms of thinking about attendance questions. I thought, since I'm asking you to consider what you might be writing a paper about, is I'm going to ask you if you've got any ideas at this point about what you are going to write your first paper about. And certainly you can say no if you wanted to say no, but if you wanted to try out an idea, certainly this is a place you could do it in the attendance question. Though of course you can always do that as well throughout the semester by either contacting me individually, or you can always address a possible idea in a journal. And as you know, we've got a little bit of time before the first paper is due, but I wanted you to begin thinking now, sooner rather than later. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well, and enjoy the ending of Much Ado About Nothing. Take care.